This video is for Chapter 2 of your textbook. Chapter 2 is entitled Understanding Health. So in order to get this chapter started, and you probably noticed this if you already previewed the lecture notes, I'm going to start off with kind of my own overview of some of our primary concepts related to health. And then the second half of the lecture, I'll go over the book material, the models and the discussion of traditional and alternative complementary medicine. So, and I'm doing that just because I think even though this chapter is entitled Understanding Health, they don't really actually talk about what health is before just kind of launching into these very academic models. So I just kind of want to have a discussion about these concepts and kind of what these concepts, how they present themselves in America, like what some of our measurements related to those concepts suggest, before I get into the discussion of those models. So what is health? So health used to just mean the absence of disease. So if you weren't in fact sick, ill, then, alternatively, you thus were healthy. But now the popular definition, and the one that was if not created, at least supported and advanced by the World Health Organization, is the state of complete mental, physical, and social well-being. So it's a very holistic, definition. It also can, of course, now be a much more subjective definition. So, if we're thinking about this definition of health, it raises the question, how healthy do you think the United States is? What are some current health problems that relates to physical, mental, social well-being that, you see in the United States? And obviously, probably at the top of everyone's list right now are issues related to the pandemic, right? The actual disease itself, COVID-19. But then if you think about that expanded definition, social well-being, the number of people that are reporting kind of increased anxiety and depression issues and loneliness, right? All of that can kind of go into our evaluation of the United States population's health right now. And that's on top of the normal issues, health issues that we normally have. So when it's not a pandemic and I'm teaching this, normally, students raise things like, opioid addiction, obesity, cancers, heart disease, depression and anxiety, all types of health issues that they have noticed or read about or know are pretty predominant in our population. And so, just focusing on one, something like obesity. This is one that, this just kind of shows you whether you're talking about obesity or whether you're talking about some other health-related issue. This gives you a sense of how we use methodology, which will be the focus of Chapter 4, to kind of gather this data so that we can make these statements, so that we can understand this phenomena, right? So one way that we do it is, we can track it over time longitudinally. It gives us a change of over time. And so you see that one graph that kind of lets you know how the number of Americans between the ages of 20 and 74, so basically our adult population, how our obesity rate has changed over time. And then the other snapshot gives you a sense of prevalence of obesity throughout different subgroups, whether that's based on race or gender or high, low, middle income. So this is a snapshot of prevalence at one given time. So this is cross-sectional data. You know, sometimes we use our data and we, instead of doing graphs and charts, you know, we'll do like maps. And so what you'll see here is a map related to physical activity, because that is one of those contributing factors most people feel to obesity, is our activity rate. And so you see this mapped out on a United States map, you know, which states have significantly lower than the US average when it comes to physical activity, which states have significantly higher. You know, you see your state of California is significantly higher. Whether you yourself are active or not, I will say, as someone who came from North Carolina, a state that's less but not significantly different from the US average, and then moved to California and now back in North Carolina, I've prioritized you know, physical fitness, like really almost my entire life. I've been a runner and into going to the gym. But it was so much easier in a state like California, where there were a lot of options and a lot of other people doing it. And so it created a social environment where that made this activity much more likely. And I say that, I emphasize that idea that an area can create an environment that makes an individual activity more likely, you know, relating back to our previous discussion about agency and agency versus social structure, and our upcoming discussion where we're going to talk about that social model of health, because this is kind of a good example of what's meant by that social model of health. That, you know, we can study how, not just how individuals make decisions about their health, but how individuals are embedded in specific societies, where some health activities might be more or less likely. And I sometimes think that, like, using these state maps to kind of map out the differences between states is sometimes a good way of really emphasizing the larger social and cultural kind of context around some of these health behaviors. And of course, another kind of contributing factor to that change in obesity rates has to do with, you know, changes in our diet. And this is a graph that shows you in terms of where we get our calories from: grains, fats, meat, sugars, you know, the change in that composition between 1970 and 2010. So it's a nice comparison graph that is also kind of comparing across two different time periods, right? So all of this just kind of shows you, you know, how we use this data to graphically depict a phenomena that's going on. Now, another kind of health-related term that you will see pop up in this textbook is the term disability, which the definition that we often use in the sociology of health and wellness is that it is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's everyday activities. And if going by that definition, when we look at the number of people who are disabled in America, that number has increased over time. It is increasing. And there are a lot of reasons that you can give for that. Of course, if you're thinking about in terms of mental conditions, there is this greatest awareness and recognition of mental disabilities, you know, how we diagnose them, as well as the number that we are recognizing. So that contributes to it. Particularly for physical disabilities, a lot of it has to do with the fact that our medical technology has increased so that people that would have perhaps just not been able to survive a surgery, you know, now they survive, but perhaps with a disability. You know, think about the rise in artificial limb technology, the number of burn victims that we can now save because we've advanced, you know, we've advanced technology in that way. Particularly, our neonatal care has increased. So children, babies that were born early with a variety of conditions, their mortality rate used to be a lot higher than they are now. Now, of course, we have an increased likelihood of saving such babies, but not always without accompanying disabilities. And I have a cousin that is That is basically his story. Born early with a large range of both physical and mental disabilities. Um, Technology certainly allowed him to survive, and he is still, surviving, is alive currently. But that does mean, with his survival, that he does have a pretty significant number of disabilities. Another thing that's contributed to the number of disabilities in society is the fact that we have had prolonged military interventions in other countries. We've had our military in different spots in the Middle East, as well as Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and as our soldiers are once again, because of advances in medical technology, some of the injuries that would have killed soldiers 30, 40, 50 years ago, of course, now we are in fact able to save those soldiers, but oftentimes disabilities, both physical and mental, are left, that they do have those consequences. And so one way we can kind of track the rise in disabilities is by looking at our disability spending, because people who have disabilities, certain significant disabilities that prevent them from being able to work or work fully, they are eligible for SSD, Social Security Disability. And so just looking at the number of dollars that we spend on SSD between 1960 and 2010, you can kind of see that it has steadily increased, and you can really see the rate of that increase really beginning, post 2000. And so once again, just encouraging, this is that kind of just encouraging us to use our sociological imagination, right? To think about that interaction between individuals and larger society, right? So understanding kind of one person with a disability that receives SSD, but in the larger context of, okay, this is a society where we've seen an increase in people with disabilities and an increase in Social Security disability spending, right? So the sociological imagination encourages you to think about both at the same time, not to lose sight of individual stories, but to place those individual stories in their larger population social context. And it's certainly another kind of population level change that we've seen. And the last time I taught this class for CSUB, which was back in 2018, I want to say, or 2018. This was actually the focus of the book that I chose that year, just in case any of you are just looking for more things to read. It was a book called Dreamland by Sam Quinones, and it told a story of the rise in opiate addiction in the United States. And you can kind of see that rise there, compared to the early 2000s to just like almost 15 years later. We've almost triple the number of deaths from prescription opioid pain relievers. And these numbers become even more stark if we then add in street opiates like heroin. Why do I relate this to disability? And that's because before, for some physical disabilities, for some chronic pain, at one point, because studies were not clear about the addictiveness of those prescription pain relievers, they were giving out opiates like your Vicodin type and Percocet type opiates. They were giving them out very freely, and it kind of created a population of people who became addicted. They were legally prescribed them, post back surgery, or, because they had chronic pain after, serving in the military. and then they become addicted. And I think one thing that that book that I assigned, Dreamland, emphasized is as they became more aware and they started to hold prescription drug companies accountable, for some of those people, for a lot of those people, the struggle to wean themselves off of the drug was real. And many turned into similar street drugs, particularly black tar heroin, to get that similar high. And relief. And so this is something that we are still having to kind of sort out. How do we confront that? And once again, just kind of understanding this from a sociological perspective, right? The story of individual addicts, of individual families that have people who are addicted to opiates in their families, and what's that has meant. But then this is also the story of a larger society, and how this is kind of starting to shape our response. That our response to this crisis has been very different than our response to other drug addiction crises, and trying to understand, why that is. That is how sociologists approach this issue. And then kind of, when, they also put mental health disorders, the World Health Organization says, it is about physical, social, and mental wellness. And certainly when we look at mental health disorders in the United States, depression and anxiety is kind of our number one mental health disorder. And about 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 5 Americans experience a mental health disorder in a given year. Mental illness, serious mental illness, of which, like, if anxiety, depression is considered to be a mental disorder, more serious mental illness might be something like schizophrenia. This is a much smaller percentage, but it is still, as you can see there in that chart, this is still a very sizable proportion of our population. And just continuing to encourage you to think about this sociologically, and how there's this ripple effect. You see that chart there that says, the number of work days that are lost to depression each year, the cost to the United States economy of mental illness, as well as just the number of people that have a mental condition and it goes untreated. All of this just kind of emphasizes, of course, how something that might seem very personal, like your mental health, like having a mental illness, is at the same time social, right? There are these social consequences, and there are also social contributors contributing, right, to the development of these disorders and illnesses within the population. Now, I think I probably have just established that whether you're talking physical, mental, or social, in a lot of ways, America is not looking too good. But when you ask people about their health, maybe not during a pandemic, that's not when this survey happened, but normally in normal times, when you ask people about their health, Americans usually feel overwhelmingly good about their health. Most people say that they are in good health. This survey, how would you rate your own personal health? 90% said good, 1% said they didn't know, and only 9% said, bad. If we then split that into, socioeconomic status, particularly upper income people say that they are very good, but there isn't much distinction between middle income and low income. And so I usually throw this in because it raises this point, like, okay, how, like, isn't health subjective, right? Like, yes, we can ask people about, like, do you have this, illness? Do you have this disease? Do you have a disability? And then we can classify their health. But then there is, in that World Health Organization, there is just this subjective element, especially when you consider things like social health. And that's true, because we have this holistic definition of health, there is this subjective element to it. And it does make it very hard for us sometimes, to get good, clear, accurate data, because even when people have health conditions, they might say, oh yes, but I'm in good health. And if you think about why people do this, that's because, in their heads, there is always someone worse that they can be comparing themselves to. They always imagine there is a worse condition out there. And so this does make obtaining and analyzing health data, especially evaluations, people's own subjective evaluations of their health, a little tricky, a little difficult. Um, Probably our least subjective type of health measure has to do with like life expectancy and mortality and the role of acute and chronic disease. So life expectancy is how long the average person lives in a given society. And, one way we can think about, how healthy or not healthy America is to kind of look at our mortality rates, like, what percentage of our population is dying and at what age. And so, as you can see, we are living longer, and certainly some of our greatest kind of gains in terms of how long we're living have been made post 1980, and like a lot of that is due to increased improvements in medical technology. They can save us from a lot of things that they could not save us from before. You can just compare that to the 1900s where, the average age was 46, 48. And as a person that's about to turn 40, that makes me really glad that I'm not, that I am living significantly 120 years in the future from those life expectancies. Now, of course, life expectancy, and we'll talk about this more when we get to our chapters on gender and race and social class, when we start kind of breaking it down by those different subgroups, there is some variance. But average, women live a little longer. As you can see, it's almost 82, and men is 77. In the year 2020. And that's great. We have had improvements in our country. Now, of course, if we want to do like a international, cross-national comparison, even with our improvements, we still lag behind other countries, particularly you can see there comparing us to other OECD countries. You see that we're behind a lot of the other OECD countries. They're the countries that, you think of as being our fully industrialized nations. It's most of our European counterparts, as well as some of the, larger, wealthier, Asian countries. That OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's basically just saying, no, we're not comparing ourselves to small struggling countries, but our economic counterpart countries, they actually live a little longer than we do. And, top 10 countries in life expectancy, this one like 2009, but America has not dramatically improved in rankings, but, sometimes when people are like, oh yes, America is the healthiest, it's the best country, it's, yeah, our healthcare isn't great, but where else would you want to be? I mean, if you're at least looking in terms of life expectancy, there are many other countries where apparently you could be and live longer. It's worth noting, if you look at a lot of those countries, they have kind of two themes in common. They're either Asian countries, and, a lot of that probably is related to lifestyle and a much healthier diet, or there are our other OECD countries, most of whom have better healthcare systems than we do. Australia, Canada, France, and Sweden. At 2009, we were ranked 50th. And, currently the life expectancy rate in America, is not. We're still, not in the high in the early rankings. I don't know why I am struggling to get my words out here. The 2019 ranking, which I couldn't find a cool graphic for, but the data is out there. We have moved up a couple of spots. We're no longer 50th, we're 46th. So, even though our life expectancy has gotten better in the last few decades, our comparison countries are still higher. And why that is, part of that has a lot to do with, if you look at how people will die in America, this shows the top 20 ways that people die each year. And if you were to look at that, the number one reason behind people's mortality in non-pandemic years is pretty consistently heart disease. And then comes like a variety of like cancers and strokes, diabetes. You have auto accidents at number 8, and you have suicide at number 11. You have the flu at number 12. You have violence at number 19, and they separate that from suicide. So, you can kind of imagine that this isn't self-inflicted violence. But this is important because what you're kind of seeing here is the distinction between chronic and acute diseases. So chronic disorders are disorders that you can live with. They rarely kill you quickly. They're more likely to be related to behavioral choices, right? What you eat, what you drink, whether you smoke, how often you exercise. And they can be controlled somewhat, usually by pharmaceuticals, but eventually they do kill you. It takes longer. Acute diseases are more severe illnesses, where usually when you get them, the time it takes for you to then die from it is much shorter. They are less likely to be related to your behavioral, health-related behavioral decisions. And although they are developing therapies and treatments to save people, they don't have the ability to be long-term managed the way that chronic diseases do. And so this represents a real shift, because the types of things that used to kill us in the 1900s were those acute diseases, were those infections, pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis. Those were the primary contributors to mortality. And now heart disease, for the most part, is not considered to be an acute disease. Like I said, it's usually related to things like, what you ate, how often you worked out, things that could have been controlled. And in some cases, if you're thinking about in terms of, hypertension, high blood pressure, right? You were even able to control it for some time. They do heart surgeries, they put in stents. It wasn't necessarily an immediate death sentence. Now, of course, in a year of a pandemic where we do have this infection, COVID-19 is an acute disease. Obviously, when we look back at the 2020 mortality statistics, this year is going to be an outlier. Just because for this acute disease, we currently have very little successful treatments, and we certainly don't have a vaccine as of yet. But in most years, it is heart disease as well as stroke that are some of the kind of primary contributors to our mortality rate. And so the kind of final little bit of new introductory material I'm going to give before we switch to the book material is that throughout this presentation, you've heard me emphasize, okay, well, we have had advances in technology, advances in technology, advances in technology. And oftentimes that is what people think of when they think of healthcare, right? They think of treatments, they think of pharmaceuticals, they think of clinicians, right, that you go to for checkups. But it's worth noting that healthcare is actually a very broad term. It's any activity that's intended to improve health. So taking a walk is healthcare. Buying fruits and vegetables at your grocery store is healthcare. Getting a good night's sleep is healthcare. Um, People sometimes treat healthcare and medicine as if they are synonyms, but they are not. Medicine is just one particular form of healthcare. It is the institutionalized system for the scientific diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of illness. And so oftentimes, by thinking that medicine equals healthcare and by focusing solely on medicine, sometimes we can ignore the ways in which that we as individuals, or we as even communities, can improve the health of ourselves and others in our community outside of this institutionalized means. And so when we're thinking about the relationship between the amount of money a society spends on healthcare and their overall health, a good solid percentage of that money is going towards medicine. It's going towards our clinicians, it's going towards our laboratories, and America in particular is going towards our pharmaceutical industry. And so if you look at, the expenditures, the healthcare expenditures in the US, is much higher than those of other developed countries. And in a perfect world, it would be like, okay, well, you get out what you put in, meaning that if we're spending a lot of money on our healthcare, then we should be healthy. We should be one of the healthier nations. And one thing I just encourage you to think about is, are we getting a good return on our investment? I know we're in 2019, we were ranked 46 in life expectancy. Anywhere from 20 to 25% of our population in a given year has a mental health disorder. We are not dying quicker. We're living sicker, meaning, it's not acute diseases that we have predominantly in our society in a non-pandemic year. It's chronic diseases. So all of these are just interesting questions to kind of just start to get you thinking about, what is this relationship between health, healthcare, and medicine in the United States? How can it be improved upon? And now the textbook material, so the textbook material just kind of jumps you immediately into this very academic discussion of this concept of health. And of course, as I already noted in video 1, because the textbook is written by authors from the UK, they're never going to have as much focus on the United States as I would like. So I'm always going to be having to introduce, that type of material. But this chapter, I did introduce a little bit more new material than I normally would, just because I really wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page about, what I mean when I am using these terms: health, disability, chronic and acute illness, and healthcare. So the chapter, though, begins by talking about there are kind of these two differing models, or two differing perspectives on health, with the most predominant model being what's called the medical model. And so the medical model can be best described by its 5 primary features. The feature number 1 is this mind-body dualism. And it's just basically the opposite of what we would consider to be a holistic approach. So they treat the body as something separate from, the mind, or from the spirit or social, so your medical model, they're interested in what is wrong with your body, not necessarily, what's wrong with, your spirit, or, your social life, or this holistic definition of wellness. Medical model almost always relies on this mechanical metaphor, meaning if you think about your body as being a machine, then practitioners need to have the knowledge onto how to fix or repair the machine. And so, it really focuses on this idea that, the body is fixable, that it is a repairable, that when something happens in your body, it is a dysfunction that needs to be fixed. There is what's called a technological imperative, and that's just that we, in the medical model, a lot of significance is attached to medical methods of interventions. This would be both surgeries as well as pharmacological interventions. So they treat the body. They treat the body by doing these interventions, as opposed to like, eating more, getting more sleep, exercising more. It's more of this focus on, surgery and drugs. Feature 4 is reductionist tendency. And that just means that they reduce all of their kind of explanations about what is wrong with a person to the physical workings of the body. And that kind of relates back to mind-body dualism, right? If you believe that the body is separate from the mind, from the spirit, from people's social lives, then and it relates to number 2 with the focus on fixing something, then the focus is going to be on fixing the body, exclusive from those other kind of more holistic kind of approaches. And then number 5, the doctrine of specific etiology. And it's just the belief that all disease and illness rises from some concrete, specific, and knowable cause, right? So if you're sick, if you're ill, if you have a disease, it had to come from somewhere. It has to have some type of specific cause. Now, the medical model is the most predominant model. I'm going to cough here. It is the more predominant model. Doesn't mean it's criticism free. Obviously one of the major criticisms, and that criticism is really built into the 5 features when you look at the mind-body dualism and the reductionist tendency. But the criticism is it doesn't acknowledge the sociological or sometimes even psychological factors. It doesn't take a holistic approach to people's health and wellness. The other major criticism, and this really speaks to that technological imperative in particular, and reductionist tendency, is the idea that it can do real harm. And it's called iatrogenesis. But this is the harm that can be caused by medical practitioners. And there are 2 ways to think of this harm. One of this harm is clinical in nature, meaning you actually get hurt, get worse because of the technological intervention, whether it's surgery, whether it's a drug, pharmaceutical, right? You've seen those commercials where the list of side effects seems longer than the list of benefits, right? And that's a good example of iatrogenesis. But then there is also this cultural iatrogenesis where there is this, by building into our culture this belief that, doctors, clinicians, clinical practitioners, and their technological interventions are the only ways in which people can better their health or get better. It ignores the things that individuals, they themselves can do. Eat healthy, get more exercise, get more sleep, meditate. When we start talking about alternative therapies, part of the reason why we've seen a rise in alternative therapies, even if people are or not even alternative, but maybe what we would consider to be complementary, like people are using them at the same time as they're going to clinical medical practitioners, it is a pushback against this message that there's nothing that individuals, they themselves can do to improve their health, to get over an illness or disease. So before we leave the medical model behind, your textbook relates that to, it is through this kind of medical model that we establish medical knowledge. And so they introduced the term social constructionism, right? That we are creating, that we are actively constructing, medical knowledge. So we think about medical knowledge as being objective, like, oh, okay, that's just established medical knowledge. But the fact of the matter is it had to be constructed by humans, right? There is this social context around medicine, right? It wasn't just, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was something that was created by humans, and it does reflect the values and ideals at the time. And so I just say that to say that, it's not necessarily value free, it's not necessarily objective, and therefore it can be wrong, and it can be biased. And we know that because we can look at some of the medical, supposedly known and accepted medical knowledge from in the past. There was a time period where they, thought that women who were educated were going to be infertile because the size of their brain was going to impact the size of their uterus, which we now, of course, know isn't true. And there was also the belief that, African Americans had a higher tolerance for pain, and so did not require the same level of pain relief or anesthetics. And, that was a belief that came out of slavery and experiments done on slaves. So, it's not that I am encouraging you to question any and all, medical knowledge, but at least to be aware that medical knowledge is constructed in a given social context. That's why it is social constructionist. And so your book talks about Jewson's paradigms of medical knowledge, where basically he's just saying, over time it's become even more technical, it's become even more advanced. The people that we accept who as having, the right to create, to construct this medical knowledge, it's become more specialized. And that's just kind of reflects some of those primary takeaways. So you do want to know the distinction between, bedside medicine, that had both medical practitioners as well as lay people, because this is back when people were getting a lot of treatment in their home, and so, especially for women's health, this was a reliance on, midwives and doulas, and people that did not necessarily go to medical school, people that kind of learned, developed their knowledge by doing. Then we had clinical medicine, and this is where we started to have a real focus on clinicians, where more of the people who were handling healthcare in the form of medicine were now medical practitioners who went to medical school. And we saw an increase in specializations as doctors became even more specialized in some parts and workings of the body, more so than others. And then finally, we have now progressed to this laboratory medicine, and this idea that disease in particular can best be understood in a laboratory as we discover etiology and use that discovery about etiology, to create vaccines and treatments. So, that takeaway that it's become more specialized, and it's also led to a shift in the nature of the relationship between the patient and practitioner, because by the time we get to laboratory medicine, that person has so much more specialized education and therefore more power in the dynamic than the patient itself. This is kind of a reversal of bedside medicine, where oftentimes the patient had more power even than the practitioner, because they were directly employing or hiring this person who perhaps was fairly limited in their formal education around the topic. So, as noted, the medical model is the predominant model, is the more popular model, but it's not the only model. The alternative model is the social model, and it speaks to that primary criticism of the medical model because it attempts to put health in a social context by understanding that it emerges out of processes and influences that go beyond the purely biological. And your book notes that the emergence of the social model kind of aligns with that shift from people dying quickly of acute disease to people living for a much longer time with chronic diseases, and a lot of those chronic diseases being related to their own behavioral decisions, and behavioral decisions that are occurring in a larger social context. So the social model does reflect the shift of thinking about the health from not just a biological to a more sociological perspective, but it's also a shift of thinking about health from individualistic terms to social, right? From, it's all about your own, physical body to, okay, it's about your body, mind, and spirit that exist in a specific social setting that has a culture. And this was the point that I was trying to make about, a state like California or Colorado, states that you have more people focusing on active, healthy living, alternative therapies. So you have more of those types of places available. You have health insurances that are more likely to compensate for those alternative therapies. You have more people, in terms of your neighbors, your coworkers, your family members who engage in these activities, making it more likely that you engage in these activities than, states like Alabama, Mississippi, in the Deep South, where, less people are vegan. So there aren't a lot of vegan restaurants, which makes it even harder for someone to want to become a vegan and successfully live a vegan lifestyle if they are living in those areas, where there are less people that do active things outdoors. And so this is reflected in public policy where there are less bike lanes, and there aren't, how some places have those bikes that you can like rent, so you don't have to own your own. So that's what's meant by looking at health from a social perspective. It's not that it's ignoring the fact that people still can make individual choices, right? Like I can go out and bike in my small town, North Carolina, even though they don't provide bikes, even though they don't provide bike lanes. Like nothing is preventing me from doing it, but it is harder. It is oftentimes much more dangerous, especially since in my county, we don't even have a leash law. So I would have to be, dodging German Shepherds and Dobermans and Pit Bulls, in addition to the cars that, because there are no bike lanes, they're much more angry at the thought of seeing bikes, and they don't see bikes as often because there aren't bike lanes. But all that's to say, I could still do it, but I am now in a social context that makes it less likely and harder for me to do it. And that's kind of what the social model is interested in. Now, there are criticisms of the social model, that by overemphasizing the social, they under-recognize the fact that a lot of health is still biological and physical in nature. And the authors believe that the social model is overly critical of the medical profession. They oftentimes emphasize the power dynamics that exist between medical practitioners, clinicians, and the average patient. And the authors say that this is a little overly critical due to the fact that compared to maybe even the 80s and the 90s, that now we are, in the early aughts, there started to be this decrease in power as the internet made information more readily available to patients, which allowed them to not just be more informed, but to kind of change their behavior in terms of consumers, right? You can shop around for a second opinion, and you can go to the doctor with all of your printouts from WebMD. I know enough doctors to know that they hate that. But if you show up with your WebMD printouts, you can force them to answer your questions, to address your concerns. And, before we had the internet with WebMD, this was something that doctors, wouldn't have had to deal with. So this is kind of what the authors mean when they talk about that diminished power. Not to mention there is this rise of alternative practitioners, which we'll talk about more here in a second, and increased government regulation. So this is just a nice comparison chart of medical and social models. Perhaps it will be helpful to you to kind of print that out, hold on to it when it's time for you to take that first test. And so the chapter ends by then talking about the approaches to health and healthcare. After it talks about the two models, it talks about the approaches. Now, it doesn't talk a lot about the biomedical approach, because really the biomedical approach pretty much is almost perfectly aligned with the medical model, and it shares many of the same tenets. You'll also see that the authors sometimes refer to this as the orthodox method or the orthodox approach. And that's just a way of saying that this is the normal way. Like, most people go to medical clinicians, doctors, people that have had the formal education to practice medicine. That is where they receive their diagnoses. That is how they receive treatment. That's what the biomedical approach is. But then there are these two other additional approaches. There's traditional approach, and then alternative complementary, which is the same thing, or isn't quite the same thing, but it's referring kind of to a similar approach. Traditional approach is steeped in the traditions and histories of a particular culture. So it can vary by country and region, by tribe, by group. It's usually holistic in nature, meaning they don't engage in mind-body dualism. Instead, they really treat the body as a whole, meaning that they are thinking about it in terms of those spiritual, sociological, psychological type of ways. Oftentimes in traditional medicine, there is this connection to magic and spirits and the spiritual world. And the remedies themselves are often derived from medicinal plants and herbs, herbs, or from animal sources. Why do people choose traditional medicine? Sometimes it's because of, well, it's right there in the name. It's because of tradition. It's what they know. It's what they've been taught. In some cases, it's due to access. There are parts of the world where traditional medicine is still very popular, because the number of traditional healers far exceeds the number of actual, like our formal medical practitioners and clinicians. Or if it's not accessibility, it's cost. It's much less costly to reach out to your traditional healer versus to go to this kind of Western hospital and interact with this Western doctor. And then there can be trust issues, all types of things. As opposed to encouraging people to completely denounce their traditional medicine, perhaps realizing, how patronizing this sounds and how upsetting it can be to people. The World Health Organization, beginning in 2014, put out this strategy that really called for trying to integrate traditional medicine into orthodox medicine, find a way for the two to work together. And they published this, and it's called the World Health Organization Traditional Medicine Strategy 2014 to 2023. So what does that look like to try to integrate? It can be really difficult. But the dangers of not doing it, of not acknowledging people's traditional beliefs, of trying to not find a way to work with them and talk to them about how orthodox medicine can correspond and complement their traditional beliefs, can result in people rejecting orthodox medicine, which can sometimes have very dangerous and sad consequences. A book that I used to use when I taught this class, another book that I used to use, was called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down: A Hmong Child, Her American Doctors, and the Collision of Two Cultures. And this book really speaks to, what happens when you have a child in particular, because, they are someone's dependent, they can't speak for themselves. And you have a child, and how orthodox, how medical doctors feel like you should best treat that child who is very sick, contradicts with how, in this case, her parents, who were Hmong refugees, what they felt like should be done given their religious and traditional beliefs. And so, to provide just kind of some background around that story, I give you a Washington Post article you can read, that just kind of summarizes some of what happens in the book. But long story short, basically the doctors struggle to find a way to work with their parents who are rejecting the technological interventions they're suggesting because it goes against their religious beliefs. And when this case happened and it did go to court, part of the outcome of this case has been, it has shed new light on how doctors need to interact with people who have these cultural beliefs that kind of fly in the face of kind of what we feel to be accepted medical knowledge and acceptable treatment for certain conditions. And to go back, the third approach to health, which is where your chapter ends, is what's called alternative health. And the other, why we sometimes call it complementary, is because instead of it being alternative, meaning people reject orthodox, the biomedical approach to health and solely do these alternative therapies, that's usually not how it works. It's become more common for people to combine the two, which is why complementary approach seems to be the more accurate way to word it. But basically, this terminology is used to describe any practice that's outside the boundaries of conventional medicine. Once again, there's this holistic emphasis, and because it relies less, much less on the technological imperative. Oftentimes, this approach to health is associated with nature, is seen as being more natural than the biomedical approach. But as I emphasize, although some people do totally reject biomedical and only embrace these therapies, alternative therapies, a lot of people do both, and that's why we refer to it as being complementary. So what's meant by these therapies? Well, this just gives you kind of a list of the different types. Herbal medicine, you're out there taking your herbal therapies. Faith healing, prayer, the laying of hands. This is where they put things like chiropractic medicine, acupuncture, massage, nutritional therapy, right? There is this movement called food is medicine. So that would kind of go there. In the United States, just to kind of look at what are some of the more common complementary forms of therapy, healthcare. Natural products is right out, right at the top. Deep breathing, some exercise therapy like yoga, tai chi, chiropractic, people that get the adjustments, meditation, massage, special diets, so all of that shows, and all of this has become more acceptable, like I said, in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And your book does discuss why, that it was during the Enlightenment with the focus on science rationality, when orthodox medicine was promoted as scientific, while traditional alternative medicine was deemed unscientific. And probably since that time period, with that label, this is science and this isn't science, there was this like a stigma then, right? Like, so if you were doing these other therapies, you were seen as being silly and irrational and non-scientific. And to a certain extent, some of that stigma maybe even remains today. Yet there has become a growing use of alternative medicine, as your book notes, at least in a complementary sense, meaning that people are doing it in addition to orthodox medicine. And they talk about some reasons why, that especially in the US, that we have a lot of growing individualism, people who are seeking private solutions as opposed to communal orientations, right? So if they can figure out a way to keep themselves safe, even if it doesn't align with kind of established medicine, then that's what they will choose, because they're concerned about their own health, not necessarily communal health. people, even though there is diminished power between medical practitioners and patients, there is still this power dynamic. You know, I went to med school, I know best, I know more than you, and that people are put off by this power dynamic. And that leads them to look for other ways of getting well, staying well, outside of that power dynamic. And your book talks about the rise of the baby boomer generation, who were, you know, grew up in a time period, even if they weren't hippies, they weren't part of the counterculture, you know, they were at least aware of that, you know, that movement, and therefore maybe as they get older are just more susceptible to this idea of, you know, natural is good, science not always good. And this just, the graph just shows you the number of Americans who choose to use complementary therapies by condition. And so a lot of these pain things, back pain, neck pain, joint pain, arthritis, right? These are chronic pains that people have, pains that they perhaps could have turned to technological intervention in the form of pharmacies, drugs. But like I said, in light of the opiate addiction, you know, more and more people are put off by the idea of using drugs to manage something that is chronic. So they are looking for non-technological interventions, right? So things like chiropractic medicine or massage or acupuncture. I myself just tried, I messed up my shoulder, my rotator cuff. You know, I've been trying dry needling as a way to be in less pain and get some mobility back in my shoulder. So, you know, just suggesting, of course, that there are reasons why we're seeing this rise in alternative medicine, or at least people using it as complementary to orthodox medicine. And the final question that, you know, I'm just going to address before ending this video is, you know, sometimes students are like, oh, if if the biomedical approach aligns with the medical model, then the alternative complementary approach must align with the social model. And that's not true. If anything, because the underpinnings of the alternative complementary approach are so very individualistic, right? Me. I myself am going to focus on what works for me, what will help me feel better, what will help me, what changes do I need to make in my lifestyle. It's a very individuated, very like focusing on the individual as the agent of change approach. And this is not what the social model is suggesting. Of course, you know, the social model is suggesting we need to change the larger social context in which, you know, people get and experience, you know, disease and illness and disability. So I don't want you to fall into the trap of thinking because the biomedical approach aligns with the medical model, that the alternative complementary approach aligns with the social model, because it does not. And that is it for chapter 2.